Tonight, we don't start with a pharaoh or a burning library. We start with a pen scratching into stone, patient, deliberate, like a heartbeat that refuses to hurry. Picture a temple wall under the Egyptian sun, flat gold light, dust hanging in the air, and a scribe leaning close enough to hear his own breath bounce off granite. Every stroke is a choice. Every bird, reed, and coiled rope is meaning stacked on meaning, a puzzle only the properly initiated can read. For 2,000 years, this is how Egypt talked to the gods, out loud and in pictures. If you're just settling in, dim the lights. Maybe let a small fan hum in the background. This is a slow mystery with a very strange twist. How do you forget your own language when it's chiseled into buildings the size of mountains? First, a confession. Hieroglyphs weren't one thing. They were a system with gears. Public monuments wore the grand costume, falcons, ankhs, sun discs, while everyday life ran on faster scripts. Scribes could shift the same language into hieratic, the cursive you use when the tax collector is waiting, and later demotic, the "don't make me write that word again" shorthand. Think of it as Egypt's triple keyboard: ceremonial, bureaucratic, and street smart. Same tongue, different costumes. So why did the costume closet lock itself and swallow the key? Start at the beginning of the end. Empires move in. First, the Persians visit with paperwork. Then Alexander shows up with a haircut and an attitude. And behind him, Greek becomes the language of getting things done. Not overnight. Egypt doesn't swap gods because a foreign general frowns at a temple, but power speaks. And often it speaks in whatever language writes the receipts. Greek slips into ledgers, court archives, shipping manifests. Priests keep the old words warm inside sanctuaries, but beyond the pylons, new clerks are tallying grain in a new alphabet. Time passes the way it always does in Egypt, quietly, under a sky that never seems to move. In Alexandria, scholars argue about vowels. In Thebes, priests polish the same hymns they learned from their grandfathers. Scribes do what scribes always do: teach the next generation, groan about their backs, and believe that tomorrow will look like yesterday. And for a while it does. Then the hinge shifts. Rome arrives, practical, as a well-made sandal. Administration thickens. Greek remains the oil in the gears. Latin has prestige, yes, but Greek signs the paychecks. If you want promotion, you must be legible to the people who stamp seals. Egypt still writes to eternity in hieroglyphs, but it increasingly speaks to authority in Greek. Two parallel tracks, running close, not touching. Here is the part nobody notices while it's happening. When a tradition moves from what everyone knows to what specialists know, it survives on institutions: schools, guilds, faith. Temple colleges become vaults that store literacy. Hieroglyphs, once the shared spectacle of a river civilization, narrow into the private language of sanctuaries. That isn't death. It's a cocoon. But cocoons depend on their branches, and history is already sharpening its knife. In the late 4th century, the empire's religious climate changes. Christianity, once persecuted, becomes the referee. Old gods don't bow, they close their doors. Edicts shutter pagan temples. Processions stop, offerings stop. And when offerings stop, stipends stop. A priestly class that had been a school system for sacred writing suddenly loses its paycheck, its students, its reason to keep grinding ink. The last hieroglyphic inscription we know about, a carved whisper on the island of Philae, dates to the year 394. A priest saying goodnight to a world that no longer answers. After that, the chisel goes quiet. But languages don't just switch off. They fade like music through a wall. Demotic, the sprinting cousin of hieroglyphs, hangs on in contracts and bills, a durable little boat on a choppy river. It lasts into the 5th century. Then that too sinks beneath the surface. A different river rises, Coptic, the Egyptian language in a new outfit, written with Greek letters, plus a few signs borrowed to catch Egyptian sounds. The meaning remains Egyptian. The letters tell a different story. The future belongs to alphabets. Coptic sings in churches while temple scripts fall asleep. Pause here and step back. Egypt didn't forget how to read because people got lazy. It forgot because the places that taught reading changed what they taught, and the reasons to learn the old system evaporated. Language is a technology. If no one funds the workshop, the machines rust. When the last generation of priests died, they took the user manual with them. Imagine a laptop sealed in stone, beautiful, indestructible, and suddenly unusable because the power cord is a ritual, the password a hymn you can't hear anymore. Meanwhile, the monuments stand there, infuriating and gorgeous. Farmers walk past gods who stare down with perfect, unreadable eyes. Travelers scratch their names into temple walls in clumsy Greek or Latin, as if tagging eternity might make it answer back. Guides invent stories. This bird means soul, someone says confidently. And this seated man is a king. They're not entirely wrong. They're not right enough to unlock the door. Centuries slide. The Nile keeps its appointment with the fields. New rulers inherit old stones and older legends. In Cairo's markets, people buy oil and gossip. Nobody asks how to write a horizon with sun rays inside it. The language inside the walls becomes a rumor, then a superstition, then a decoration. Egypt is speaking itself every Sunday in Coptic, then every Friday in Arabic. The temples are quiet as graves, but crowded with voices nobody can hear. Here's the strangest part. Egypt didn't lose itself, it translated itself. The faith changed, the alphabet changed, the masters changed. The Nile did what it always does, take whatever falls in and carry it forward. What got left on the banks was a script designed to talk to eternity, abandoned because eternity stopped paying the rent. And yet, if you press your ear to the granite, you can still hear a faint scratching. A message left unread for 1,000 years. It isn't waiting for a miracle. It's waiting for a reader. In the next part, we'll meet a rock dragged out of a fort by a bored soldier, a handful of stubborn scholars, and a young genius who taught himself to hear the dead speak. When he finally pronounces the first true Egyptian word in more than a millennium, the walls will answer, and the river of meaning will flood its banks again. Say the word, and the pictures move. Say it right, and the civilization wakes up. The story wakes again in the summer heat of 1799, in a half-ruined fort near a dusty Nile branch where soldiers were more worried about mosquitoes than mysteries. A French officer, Lieutenant Pierre-François Bouchard, walks past a fragment of black stone built into a crude wall. It doesn't gleam, it doesn't hum. It just sits there, dark and stubborn, the size of a suitcase and twice as heavy. But Bouchard squints because the face of the stone isn't blank. It's crowded. 3 bands of tiny, disciplined markings crawl across it like armies with perfect uniforms. The middle line, curved strokes that look quick, almost impatient. That's Demotic, the everyday Egyptian script gone lean and fast. The bottom is Greek, clean as marching orders. The top is the old pageantry. Hieroglyphs, neat and ceremonial. Pictures compressed until they become grammar. 3 scripts, 1 stone. A temple decree copied in triplicate, because bureaucracy, it turns out, is the undefeated empire. Napoleon's army had brought along an entourage of savants. Surveyors, botanists, engineers, artists. They were supposed to measure Egypt into understanding, to trap its past in diagrams and engraved plates. Suddenly, they had something better. Not a ruin, but a rumor of a translation key. The stone left the wall. It traveled by boat and argument. Men laid paper over its surface and dabbed ink to pull off prints, like lifting fingerprints from a god. Those impressions went north like sparks. Then the tide of war flipped. The British took the stone as spoils in 1801, and shipped it to London like a captured general. By 1802, it stood in the British Museum, grim and inscrutable, while polite crowds walked by saying, "Ah, yes, history," without the faintest notion of what it said. The museum labeled it the Rosetta Stone, after the nearest town. The name stuck. Names are sticky when they promise answers. The world now had a locked door with 3 keys fused together. The Greek line was readable. Any schoolboy in a decent European academy could make sense of it. It announced a decree praising Ptolemy Thef, a boy king of Egypt's Hellenistic era, 196 BCE, all titles in sunshine. The Greek helpfully explained that the text above said the same thing in sacred, native, and Greek letters. Sacred, hieroglyphic; native, demotic; Greek, Greek. A map drawn in daylight to find a cave in the dark. Enter Thomas Young, an English polymath who made enemies by being better at everything than anyone had time for: medicine, physics, the behavior of light, and, inconveniently, scripts. He approached the stone like a physicist: patterns, constraints, repeatable claims. He suspected the oval loops scattered among the hieroglyphs, the cartouches, framed royal names. If you can find Ptolemy in Greek and Ptolemy in pictures, you can begin to anchor sound to symbol. In demotic, he identified a set of characters corresponding to that name and proposed that demotic wasn't just shorthand for ideas. It carried phonetic values, sounds. He compiled word lists, matched Greek names to Egyptian shapes, and quietly built the scaffolding on which others would climb. But Young had a problem. He didn't breathe the Egyptian language. He was mapping a city he'd never walked, confidently, cleverly, at a distance. He advanced far, farther than many admit, then stalled on the steepest grade. Hieroglyphs weren't only pictures that meant ideas. They could also be pictures that spoke sounds. Sometimes a hawk was a god. Sometimes it was the letter for a sound in that god's name. Sometimes it was both. Without a native ear for the old tongue, the logic refused to settle. Across the channel, a different kind of mind was sharpening a different kind of tool. Jean-François Champollion grew up poor, hungry for books the way other boys were hungry for bread. He taught himself languages the way a river learns banks, by wearing them down until they let him pass. Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac, and most importantly Coptic, the last living stage of ancient Egyptian, sung on Sundays in village churches, written in Greek letters with extra signs to catch Egyptian sounds. Where others saw Coptic as a provincial relic, he saw a fossil with warm blood still inside. Champollion's notebooks read like a detective's whispers. He believed the key wasn't merely mechanical, match this picture to that name, but organic. The hieroglyphs encoded a language whose bones had not vanished. If you could hear the old Egyptian inside Coptic, you could make the birds and snakes on the stone speak, not as symbols, but as syllables. He studied the Rosetta copies until his eyes blurred. He pored over other inscriptions brought from Egypt: scarabs, obelisks, temple facades, constantly hunting for cartouches, those royal name loops with their politely trapped power. When a second bilingual gift arrived, the Philae obelisk with Greek and Egyptian texts, he found another royal name to test: Cleopatra, longer, differently shaped, full of clues. If Ptolemy gives you Ptolemy, Cleopatra offers Cleopatra. Overlapping letters, new letters, cross-checkable letters. The puzzle clicked, faint at first, then louder. Here's how you win a language from stone. You catch a single sound in a single sign and refuse to let it go. That loaf-shaped sign appears in both Ptolemy and Cleopatra, where an A should be. Hold it. This square shows up where an O belongs. Hold it. This lion sits where an L must stand. A lion for L, convenient. Perhaps too convenient. Until it appears again and again. Hold it. brick by brick. The wall stops being wall and starts being doorway. The legend says that on a September day in 1822, Champollion burst into his brother's office, scattered papers, shouted, "Je tiens l'affaire! I've got it!" and collapsed out of breath or out of blood sugar or out of a decade's worth of tension. He wasn't finished, not truly. What he had was the breathing principle. Hieroglyphs could be read phonetically when spelling foreign names and Egyptian words alike, alongside signs that stood for whole concepts and signs that clarified which meaning you meant. A system with gears, yes, but now you could feel the engine. Skeptics remained. Scholars are conservative because error is cheap and retractions are expensive. Some insisted hieroglyphs were purely symbolic, a priestly code for ideas, too lofty to be tethered to sounds like K and R. Others, defensive of Jung's claims, accused Champollion of stealing without credit. The truth, like all useful truths, was messier and richer. Jung mapped the first streets. Champollion learned the traffic laws and started driving. But don't breathe out yet. If you think our story ends with a shout and a faint, you're underestimating how stubborn stone can be. Knowing that pictures carry sounds is not the same as reading a civilization's diary. Hundreds of signs, some doubling as syllables, some as determinatives, silent labels that tell you, this word is a man, or this word is a place, or this word is an abstract thing with teeth. Grammar that curls like the river, words that shift when they stand next to kings. Imagine a candlelit study in 1823. Dust floats like golden ghosts. Sheets of paper are everywhere, edges curling, margins crammed with tiny letters, numbers, sketches of birds, and fragments of a dead language trying to rise again. Jean-François Champollion sits in the center of it all, sleepless eyes blazing. On one side lies the Rosetta inscription. On the other, dozens of rubbings from obelisks and sarcophagi sent by soldiers, travelers, and collectors. He's not just reading, he's excavating. He picks up one scrap, then another. Each hieroglyph is an old sound trapped inside a picture. The bird is an A, the reed is an I, the snake hisses D. But sometimes the same snake hisses silence, just there to mark that a word concerns something living. Nothing is straightforward. It's a system of echoes. You must learn not just to see, but to hear the rhythm behind the image. He murmurs to himself in Coptic, Re, the sun, Per, a house, Neter, a god. The same root still whispered by Coptic priests in faraway Egyptian churches. Slowly, it begins to align. He realizes that ancient Egyptian wasn't lost. It had been sleeping in plain sight, wearing new letters. In his letters to friends, he writes with barely contained awe. It is the same language, he insists, from the pharaohs to the Copts. For the first time, someone is bridging 3,000 years with a single voice. His desk becomes an orchestra. Every sign has its instrument. Some loud, some faint, some harmonic. A single word might be composed of a hawk, a reed, a basket, and a seated man. When combined, they sing. The basket could mean Lord, but if it follows a falcon, it becomes the sound NB, and the falcon's cry is Hor, Horus, the sky god, meaning inside meaning, sound inside silence. And then, one evening, it happens. He pieces together a full phrase from the walls of a temple fragment. The symbols unfurl into speech. The king of Upper and Lower Egypt, beloved of the gods. For a moment, he just stares. The candles flicker. He's hearing the voice of a man dead for 30 centuries. Not through legend, not through myth, but through his own tongue. The grammar matches the Coptic word order. The vowels hum familiar tunes. His hands tremble. He isn't inventing a code. He's unlocking a living system. He reads more, faster. Inscriptions that once looked like art now pulse with gossip and prayers. He can follow a royal dedication, a hymn to Osiris, a tax decree. For the first time, Egypt stops being a symbol and becomes a conversation. Paris doesn't know what to do with him. Universities praise, then doubt. Some claim he is dreaming. Others whisper jealousy. British scholars grumble that Young was there first. The argument grows academic and petty. But the truth doesn't care who prints it first. Truth waits for the one who listens hardest. In 1824, Champollion writes a letter to the Royal Society of Antiquaries in Paris, laying out his method. Dozens of pages of signs, phonetic values, grammatical forms, comparisons to Coptic roots. He is methodical, cold in his proofs, hot in his faith. He calls his system alphabet and syntax united. Still, Egypt remains far away, like a voice over water. He needs to see the walls himself, to walk beneath the hieroglyphs, to trace them where they live, not on plaster copies. He begs, petitions, waits. At last, in 1828, with official backing and a fragile heart, he sails for Egypt. The voyage is a blur of heat and wind. The Nile unrolls like an ancient manuscript, temples rising from the sand, like punctuation marks from a divine story. Each stop feels like homecoming. He walks under gateways, where gods stare down with impossible patience. The villagers watch the foreigner press paper to stone, whispering to himself. At Karnak, he kneels before walls taller than cathedrals, covered in glyphs so fine they look stitched rather than carved. His fingers follow the grooves. The falcon of Horus, the scarab of Khepri, the lotus blooming at the end of a king's name. He can read them, haltingly, but truly. He reads aloud, Men Keper Ra Jezer Kara, chosen of the sun, beloved of Amun. The echoes bounce through the hypostyle hall. His assistant stares, mouth open. For centuries, these walls had been mute to foreign ears. Now, they answer. One evening at Thebes, as the sunset bleeds over the pylons, Champollion reads an entire cartouche aloud, from start to finish. His voice cracks. A priest nearby, hearing the old sounds shaped by a foreigner, falls to his knees and weeps. To him, it's as if the gods are breathing again. Champollion spends months moving from ruin to ruin, verifying everything. Each time his translation matches the carved reality. He grows quieter, more reverent. Egypt is no longer a mystery, it's a resurrection. He writes in his journal, These stones are no longer dumb. They speak, they think, they live again. But the Nile exacts its price. Fever grips him. The sun burns his eyes. The sand claws his lungs. His health crumbles as his understanding sharpens. Each temple gives him both revelation and exhaustion. Still, he won't stop. In Luxor, he writes the first Egyptian grammar in nearly 2,000 years. He compares hieroglyphic, hieratic, demotic, and Coptic, proving their family ties beyond denial. For every critic, he provides 10 examples. For every theory, a translation carved in granite. By the time he returns to France in 1830, he's thin, gray, and coughing blood, but triumphant. Europe's salons finally understand. The puzzle is solved. The hieroglyphs aren't symbolic poetry. They're structured speech. Egypt isn't an eternal silence. It's a library, and he holds the key. His lectures draw crowds that can't even find Egypt on a map. They come for the miracle, a man who made stones talk. He reads passages from temple walls, translating in real time, his voice trembling but clear. For a moment, every listener feels the same vertigo. The past is speaking through him. He ends one lecture with a line he once carved into his notes. Human genius did not invent writing to forget. It invented it to remember. The news of Champollion's triumph rippled through Europe like lightning through old paper. In the salons of Paris, scholars whispered his name with a kind of nervous awe, half envy, half reverence. For 2,000 years, Egypt had been a beautiful enigma. Now, one man had cracked it open. But victories of the mind are never simple. The moment you open a door to the past, everyone wants to argue about who owned the key. England refused to kneel. The British Museum still held the Rosetta Stone, and with it came pride. Thomas Young's supporters claimed that their countrymen had done the heavy lifting, that Champollion had simply dressed up the conclusions. French newspapers retaliated, printing passionate defenses of their prodigy. "He did not borrow," one wrote. "He conquered." In truth, both men had their share of genius, but only one could hear the pulse of Egyptian speech beating beneath the stone. Champollion had something Young never did, the soul of a linguist who didn't just want to read Egypt, but to speak with it. Still, fame came at a brutal cost. His lungs had weakened in Egypt. His heart was failing. When he lectured, he coughed blood into his handkerchief, then wiped it away, and continued as if the body had no right to interrupt revelation. He worked day and night, compiling grammars, lexicons, translations. His desk became a battlefield of ink, papyrus rubbings, and medical prescriptions he never followed. Friends begged him to rest. "You've done it, Jean," they said. "You've proved it. Let others continue." But he only smiled and whispered, "The gods have been silent for too long. I can't stop now." By 1832, exhaustion won. Champollion collapsed in his study, surrounded by drafts of what would have been his life's magnum opus, the Egyptian grammar. He was only 41. Paris mourned him as a national treasure. Egypt mourned him as the first man in millennia who had truly listened. His brother Jacques finished editing and published the grammar posthumously. It became the cornerstone of Egyptology. A generation of students grew up tracing the same falcons, reeds, and suns with trembling hands, repeating Champollion's phonetic tables as if they were prayers. The age of speculation was over. The age of understanding had begun. In the decades that followed, an empire of curiosity took shape. Excavations exploded across Egypt. British, French, and German teams raced to uncover temples, tombs, and lost cities. Hieroglyphs spread across Europe like wildfire. Museums filled with stelae and sarcophagi, each labeled not with mystery, but translation. Offering to Osiris, prayer of the king, song of the sun. What was once magic became language. What was once legend became literature. But knowledge, like empire, breeds obsession. As the 19th century deepened, archaeology became a fever. Men with shovels dug not just for truth, but for trophies. The desert echoed with dynamite and ambition. Ancient walls crumbled for souvenirs. Champollion's dream, to understand Egypt, began mutating into something colder, to own it. In 1922, when Howard Carter broke the seal of Tutankhamun's tomb, the world gasped again. Reporters wrote about curses, jewels, gold. But the real treasure lay on the painted walls, where hieroglyphs told not of death, but of continuity. The same grammar, the same gods, the same eternal hunger for memory. Thanks to Champollion, those walls were not just decoration. They were voices. Meanwhile, Egypt itself was changing. Colonial flags rose and fell. The Coptic churches still murmured in the last living echo of the ancient tongue. Scholars refined the translations, arguing over syntax, nuance, vowel placement. Each discovery added a shade of human warmth. A farmer complaining about taxes, a craftsman praying for strength, a widow calling on her husband's his spirit. By the 20th century, technology joined the conversation. Photographs, microfilm, and later computers began cataloging inscriptions faster than any human could read them. Linguists digitized Champollion's tables. Satellites mapped buried temples beneath sand. Lasers scanned walls at night, capturing carvings invisible to the naked eye. The language that had once vanished into silence now echoed in data clouds. And yet, despite all this science, the emotional truth remained exactly as Champollion had felt it that night in his candlelit room. This was not just about reading old words. It was about hearing the heartbeat of a civilization. Every falcon, every coil, every scarab was a pulse of human intent. Someone's prayer, someone's boast, someone's goodbye. Egypt had never forgotten itself. It had simply waited for us to listen correctly. At the British Museum today, the Rosetta Stone still stands beneath glass, under the same label it has worn for more than 2 centuries. Tourists lean close, pressing cameras against reflections. Few of them know that the middle section, the Demotic script, was nearly erased when it was discovered, or that the top lines of hieroglyphs were incomplete. Fewer still realize that everything we now read began because one stubborn young man refused to believe that pictures couldn't talk. If you stand quietly near it long enough, you can almost imagine hearing the voices that haunted Champollion's nights, the clink of chisels in temple courtyards, the hum of priests reciting dawn hymns, the faint laughter of scribes teaching their apprentices to draw a bird with the right tilt of the wing. Because that's the real magic of the Rosetta Stone. Not that it held the code, but that it reminded humanity what language truly is. Memory carved into matter. The desert never forgets. It only buries. Beneath layers of wind and time, Egypt's silence waits, not dead, but patient. And if you stand on the bank of the Nile at dawn, you can still feel it. The weight of millennia pressing through the mist, whispering in a language your bones almost recognize. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since Champollion's eyes first danced across those ancient signs. Yet somehow, the story of his discovery feels unfinished, because the real miracle wasn't that he read Egypt, but that he taught the world to listen again. Today, the language he revived reaches farther than he ever dreamed. On the screens of modern Egyptologists, digital scrolls shimmer with restored glyphs. Artificial intelligence analyzes the patterns of ancient syntax. Lasers illuminate carvings so faint that even the desert itself had forgotten them. Entire tombs can now be reconstructed in virtual space, hieroglyphs glowing as they once did under flickering oil lamps. In 2024, a team of linguists in Luxor managed to digitally repaint erased texts using multispectral imaging. The inscriptions told of an artisan named Nebamun, who had prayed not for gold or fame, but for words that would live longer than his bones, words that would last forever. And he was right. Every year, hundreds of thousands of visitors wander through the temples of Karnak and Luxor, the Valley of the Kings, the island of Philae. Most come for the wonder, the photographs, the feeling of walking where gods once walked. But some, quiet ones, the ones who linger, find something deeper. They look at the walls not as tourists, but as witnesses. Because now, thanks to the cracked stone from Rosetta and a feverish scholar who refused to give up, those walls can finally speak for themselves. Listen closely. You can almost hear the cadence. The sun rises again, life returns, the river endures. Egypt's hieroglyphs were never meant to be silent pictures. They were living breath, frozen mid-chant. To read them is not to translate, it is to resurrect. And so the story comes full circle. What began as chisel marks beneath a burning sky, reborn through war, genius and obsession, returns now to the rhythm of sand and river. The old gods no longer need offerings. They have memory instead. The words of kings and farmers alike have achieved what no tomb, no monument, no empire could promise: permanence. But here's the secret that still startles scholars today. In resurrecting Egypt's voice, Champollion didn't just give the past to the present. He gave the present back to itself. He reminded humanity that silence is only ignorance wearing a mask. Every culture, every ruin, every lost word can speak again if someone loves it enough to listen. In Cairo, a young Egyptian researcher named Layla stands before the Rosetta Stone replica in the Grand Museum. Her hand rests on the cool glass, eyes tracing the same signs Champollion once did. She reads softly, in perfect modern Coptic mixed with Arabic tones. Ankh, Wedja, Zeynep. Life, prosperity, health. Around her, tourists chatter, cameras click, guides recite facts. But in her voice there's reverence. She isn't reading history. She's speaking continuity. Somewhere deep beneath the museum floor, the Nile moves as it always has, slow, eternal, murmuring the same syllables it whispered to pyramid stones and papyrus reeds. The same words that built civilization, the same rhythm that Champollion caught between his heartbeat and the scratch of his pen. When you hear it, even for a moment, something inside you answers. Because Egypt's story is not just Egypt's, it's humanity's, our refusal to let meaning die. One language was forgotten, yes. But through one man's obsession, millions learned to remember again. And that perhaps is the real translation of eternity.